Hi there and welcome to Real Talk in ELT, a podcast about the reality of teaching English. I'm your host, Kelly Pennington. Thank you for joining me today.
Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm very excited for my guest today, André Hedlund. Welcome.
Thank you.
And yeah, we're gonna totally geek out on some neuroscience and mind-brain education stuff. I'm very excited. So let me give everybody a brief bio. André Hedlund is the Chevening. Is that
Chevening? That's it's weird, but that's how it's pronounced. Yeah.
Chevening alumnus in psychology of education from the University of Bristol, an educational consultant, speaker, and guest lecturer on bilingualism and cognition in postgraduate courses. He's also a member of the Brastissel's Mind, Brain, and Education SIG, and the academic director for EduFest. Which has an event coming up soon in Italy, correct?
Yes, we're very excited. Yes, in Trapani, Sicily. So you can imagine.
And what's the date on that?
It's a month from now. It's actually the 21st of August. Yeah.
Of August. Okay.
Yeah.
And he's the author of The Owl Factor: Reframing Your Teaching Philosophy, and he blogs at edcrocks.com. Welcome.
Yes, thank you very much. It's so weird when people read your bio, right?
It is.
You keep nodding because that's it.
Right.
Yeah, but
correct.
Cool. Yeah. Awesome.
Okay, so I'm really excited today because I'm kind of a nerd, a secret nerd. Well, maybe I've just outed myself as a nerd. I'm really into
like
this.
You a little bit more now, Kelly. I had no idea, so I'm finding out this right now with you guys listening to us. So,
really geeky, yeah. I'm excited about this stuff because I love to learn the science stuff, and I always find that I don't have enough time to dedicate. So who better to bring on and pick your brain than André, right?
Yeah.
So would you like to kick it off and kind of let us know where your focus is and what we're going to be looking at today?
Sure. Yes. It's funny that, I met you in person a couple of days ago, a week ago or so, right?
I know, less than 2 weeks.
Yeah. So we were both at the Brastisso International Conference in São Paulo, and I had a major, amazing, geeky chat with one of my buddies, Rodolfo Machello. And it's, the stuff that we should have recorded because, like generations from now should watch that conversation because we basically match things that should not be matched. We just look at sci-fi movies and TV series and science and linguistics and neuroscience, and I feel like this is basically what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to try to connect a couple of neuroscientific stuff and psychological stuff to the geek inside of each one of us, I guess. So because I feel that that's a very good analogy, isn't it? It's not just about knowing, the jargon and, the research, the papers and all of that, but really understanding from a different perspective and using analogies. This is very, very good actually for the brain. So whenever you understand something from a more concrete point of view, I think it makes more sense. It becomes more memorable. So maybe that's what we're going to do here today, talk about neuroscience, where you can find neuroscience related stuff, especially if you are a teacher trainer, perhaps even a school manager, a parent, and what kind of things you should probably be careful about because they're not really reliable. So we call them neuromyths. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well.
Oh, good, because I feel like there's a lot of them out there, and I want to know what is the accurate information or not, right?
And that's the thing, Kelly, they're just popping up everywhere, I would say. But that's because of research. That's how science works. And sometimes I found out, for example, that the growth mindset, which is something that we talk about all the time, is not that reliable anymore because of the interventions that have been made based on this idea of a growth mindset. And this is how science works. We figure something out, and then we test it, and then maybe there's another tool or a different question, and then we just go with it, and then we see that, well, maybe it wasn't that cool or reliable after all. And then so that's why we never really know anything for sure, I think, in neuroscience.
Well, that was actually one of my questions. So you mentioned it, and I guess we can kind of dig in here. So as a teacher or a parent or a school coordinator, where can people find information on this? And is it too early to implement procedure from this type of information? And then we can get into the information that people can find. Yeah.
So that's a great question. We don't really, I think we don't have just one source, like a good source. I think we have different areas or fields of knowledge that we can look at. For example, educational neuroscience should be a reliable source, of information about the brain and how, and not only about neuroscience, because we don't really need to know how the brain works that much into detail, and I feel like you don't need to understand everything about neuroscience for you to be able to use the principles that probably will yield some interesting outcomes in terms of learning, right? So educational neuroscience is one. Cognitive psychology, most certainly, is another field. I would say neuroeducation, just be careful with the neuro stuff, because everybody wants to add neuro to everything they do, because as my professor used to say, it's sexy. And then whenever you have a neuro something, people attend your session because they want to know more about the brain. But maybe they don't have the proper qualifications to talk about the brain, right? And I'd say the mind-brain education area, that this one is I'd say the most reliable one, because it's not just neuroscience. Mind, brain education. Mind is psychology. Brain is neuroscience. Education is, pedagogy, andragogy, whatever, different areas of education. And it's really transdisciplinary. So you're not just relying on one parent field. You're just looking at everything. And that's what makes it really cool and reliable, because you ask a question like, what does neuroscience know about this strategy here? What are the areas in the brain that activate when a person does something like this,
Right.
And are those areas supposed to be activating according to our knowledge of neuroscience of the brain? Yes. And then you ask psychology. Does psychology have a theory to explain why this should be working or not, or happening or not? And I think that's what makes MBE, mind-brain education, so reliable, because we're really checking all the time with other areas. And so we can use that. We should keep
confirming.
Using that. Exactly. We're confirming.
Definitely. So then that being said, what does MBE teach us, or what do we know right now?
Yes.
Like good information, reliable information.
Yeah. Well, this is a tricky one, because, we've been doing a lot of things for the past, couple of decades that are not really sound, scientifically sound.
Oh, goodness.
And we found out a lot of things, especially in the last 2 decades, because now we have neuroimaging technologies. I mean, we've had it for a couple of decades, more like since the 1990s, even 1980s, I think. But still, nowadays we can actually ask very interesting questions and see what's happening inside someone's brains, like a fMRI, for example, magnetic resonance imaging, right? And one of the things that we've known for a while now is that learning styles, the whole learning styles thing, is not really reliable, which for most people...
Is this the first neuromyth?
Yeah, this is a neuromyth, exactly.
Okay.
For a lot of people, it might come as a shock, actually, because, many people probably change their practice to sort of accommodate different styles in the classroom. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It could be actually a very good thing. But then let's imagine you only have, you only teach business English students, like one-to-one classes, and then you do one of those learning styles questionnaires, like to find out what learning style this person has. And then suddenly they came out as an auditory learner. And then you might feel that you don't need to use any visuals, for example, not necessarily, because they learn best by listening, hearing what you have to say, right? So there's a phonological component there that is more predominant. But that doesn't make a lot of sense from a neuroscientific perspective, because everything we learn is encoded in different ways in the brain, So we actually build multiple representations of whatever we're learning using all of our senses, so we shouldn't really favor one over the other, that's sad. Basically what we do to find out what people have done to find out that the whole learning styles things is not really accurate is, well, get some people, test them, establish what learning style they have, and teach them according to that learning style, and then check the results, and then when we check the results, guess what? They didn't learn better than the other ones who received input in different ways, like
well, it's
visual,
interesting
auditory.
because I think some CPD courses still teach this, right? Still demand that when we're doing needs analysis or something along those lines, that we need to integrate one of those components as well in terms of let's classify our learners. So definitely. It hasn't quite transferred into the CPD courses yet.
Yeah. So last time I checked, and it's been a while. I mean, maybe 3 years, because so my professor, who's a big reference in the area, Paul Howard Jones, who's a professor at the University of Bristol. So he studied that, neuromyths, and there are papers that have been replicated all over the world. And on average, more than 70% of teachers actually believe in the learning styles neuromyth, everywhere, basically. And again, it's an interesting idea. It kind of feels right, to classify people, to categorize people according to, some people, they do like to take notes and I don't know, draw a couple of schemes.
But perhaps we can't categorize them. Perhaps they just have a tendency of doing that. Yeah. But we still need to stimulate all of the other components as well for them to learn.
Exactly.
Okay.
So basically, let's say if you are a visual learner and you like to, write things down and draw little circles and schematics and whatever, and then you compare that to, taking notes and listening and let's say doing something more tactile or more kinesthetic, right?
Okay.
You learn better when you explore different types of input. So if the danger, I think, about about the learning styles thing is that you might want to concentrate everything you do according to that one particular predominant learning style, and then not explore other ways of delivering input, and that's, since the brain is highly interconnected and we have 86 billion neurons in our brain, right? And they can connect potentially 1,000 times or more, 10,000 times, it's better for you to actually receive input from different types, different sources, different ways, different types of media, so that you can increase or strengthen your neural network in the brain, right? So it's easier to retrieve that information later. So that's the danger, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see that people could definitely fall into that trap where they design lessons very specifically and they neglect some of the other, which is actually not great for their students. Okay.
Yep.
Any other neuro myths that you want to bring up?
Oh, there's so many. Okay. Well, there's this one that it's potentially less harmful, I think. It's the one that I'm sure you've heard this one. We only use 10% of our brain. Somewhere.
Well, I probably do.
Well, maybe we do sometimes.
Who knows?
but there was even a movie with Scarlett Johansson. Remember that one, Lucy?
So right, where she she became this. Yeah, I remember that.
Exactly. And then this one was really funny because I remember I was still in the UK for it was during my master's, and I sent a proposal to Innovate ELT in Barcelona. And then they invited me to write a blog post for them. And then I said, I had no idea. What am I going to write about? Something about my talk, right? I was going to talk about the MBE science. And then I remember that I watched that movie on the weekend, Lucy, right? And I saw this is total BS, right? I said, oh my goodness. Anyway, that's the title of my blog post. No, we don't use 10% of our brain, And then the thing is, there is a very cool scene in the movie, and Morgan Freeman, with his deep, wonderful voice, he he's a professor of neuroscience somewhere, and he's lecturing his students. And then he starts by saying something like, if we use 20% of our brains, we would be able to do this and that. And one of the students asks, what if we could use 100% of our brain, and then we would be able to interfere with matter, like, Scarlett Johansson can do that at the end of the movie, right? And then I say something, let's just say if Scarlett Johansson from that movie was in the Avengers, she wouldn't need anyone else to defeat Thanos, So like it was
right.
Because again, why do we say something like that? Where does that come from? It's really it doesn't make any sense really right now what we are doing. I mean, I'm talking, you're listening to me, I'm looking at the camera, I'm sitting
somewhere, the cameras are all over.
Yeah. And then there's so many areas of our brains right now that are being activated. Like, I have to think about the things I'm going to say. So I'm using my prefrontal cortex, my working memory. I'm also using language. So my left temporal lobe is very active, I'm also, looking at the camera, looking at the screen of my computer. So my occipital lobe, where the visual cortex is also activated. So many areas of my brain are doing so many things right now that it doesn't even make sense for you to say that we only use 10%. And we're not doing anything too complicated. We're just having a conversation, right? And so imagine when you're doing, walking, for example. So you have your primary motor cortex, your cerebellum, like coordinating how you walk, your steps, and all of those things are active when you're doing something a little bit more complex. So it doesn't make sense, really. It's a huge neuromyth. Yeah.
And where did that come from? Why did they say 10%? What was the origin of this random number?
So that's the thing, right? I did some research on that. We don't know for sure, honestly. It's the same thing with the number of neurons that we have. Many books back in the day mentioned that we had 100 billion neurons. So that was an estimate that nobody really knows where it came from. And the only person who actually got to a very close number was a Brazilian researcher, Susana Herculano Rosol. She's from Rio, but she's based in the US, I think. And she was able to isolate each nucleus because every neuron has a nucleus. And then, so she basically made brain soup, which is pretty cool for geeks out there, So she put a brain.
I can just imagine this whole process.
That's the thing. She used detergent to isolate the nucleus, the nuclei of all of the neurons. And then she blended inside a blender, like really like a smoothie, like a brain smoothie. And then you could, then of course, the little dots that represent the nucleus of one neuron, they were somehow isolated inside this detergent bubble, and then you could see with a microscopic, with an electronic microscope, could actually count a certain area of this liquid, and then you could extrapolate, and then she got to 86 billion neurons, which is the best estimate that we have, right?
I mean, it's a little creepy. It's a little like,
it is
horror
creepy,
scene,
right?
but yeah, it's good to know. Facts.
That's the thing. I think a lot of those neuromyths, they just came from, I don't know, wishful thinking. Like, it maybe if I tell myself that I only use 10% of my brain, I can make an effort to be better, to do more. I don't know. Just it doesn't make a lot of sense. And possibly the early had from different types of neuroimaging and other technologies to check brain activity. Maybe there's something related to that. Like we have EEG. Basically, there are electrodes that you put on somebody's head, like a helmet with electrodes, and you can measure the electrical fields, let's say, inside your brain. And then, of course, there's a needle that goes up and down, and then you can see where. I mean, it's not very accurate in terms of where is it coming from, which area of the brain is it coming from. But then, of course, depending on the reading, depending on what you're doing, it goes up and down. Maybe people extrapolate it, and we just use 10% of our brain.
Yeah, the instruments were relatively rudimentary. They've become more obviously advanced as we've kind of moved forward. Okay.
Exactly.
Well,
Yeah.
I don't know if I use more than 10%.
I'm pretty sure you do, Kelly. You can trust yourself, Even
I
when
hope
you're
so.
sleeping. When you're sleeping, you're using quite a lot of your brain because you're consolidating memory, you're kind of cleaning your brain. So it's very important. Getting enough sleep is really important. We are the only species on the planet that actually interrupts our sleep cycle on purpose to go to work and to go to school.
Oh.
I mean, dogs don't have an alarm to wake them up. Like, we are the only ones who do that, and that's not very good for a memory consolidation. But we have to work, we got to go to school. What
That's
can we
true.
do, right?
Yeah, overall health is just, sleep is very important. Okay.
Yeah.
I do have a couple questions from people, so let me ask you one.
Yeah.
This comes from Kieran, and he asks, can you share any learning hacks that could be applied in the classroom?
Yeah, that's a great. There are 4 I can share that they're actually part of the same concept, and I think people should use them more often. It's called desirable difficulties. So desirable difficulties by Robert Bjork. So he was, I think he still is a professor of cognitive psychology and neuroscience at the University of California, UC Davis or LA. It's in California.
We can find it. We'll link it in the show notes
Robert
somewhere.
Bjork, yeah, and his wife Elizabeth Bjork, and basically desirable difficulties. They can be a little bit counterintuitive for most teachers because we tend to think that we should make learning easier for our students. In a way, we should, of course. We have to reduce
in terms of
cognitive.
Exactly. Exactly. Okay.
Scaffolding is wonderful. It works. Vygotsky was really right about that. If you give your students too much of a challenge, they will just freeze. Their amygdala is going to signal. It's the FFF response. Fight, flight, or freeze, and then they cannot really do a lot of cognitive work in that state. So definitely use scaffolding. It works, but you can and you should make challenging learning more challenging, a little bit more difficult. And how can you do that? There are 4 things you can do. The first thing you can do is called retrieving. So retrieving is basically when you've just exposed your students to something, and then you ask them to tell you what you've just exposed them to. It's kind of like a CCQ, a concept checking question. So you said, well, we're learning this, and you gave them input, or they worked with the material, and then you just ask them to close the book, look at you and say, what can you remember? What have we been discussing so far? Or share with a partner something you remember from the first section of our lesson or something like that. So that's retrieving. And that's a desirable difficulty because it requires effort. For you to retrieve something from your cortex, your brain, you need to apply a certain amount of effort. And that reinforces the neural network as you are consolidating memory. So that's one.
Is it kind of like if you are driving somewhere and you're using a GPS, you're not really
You're
putting
not
so
really,
much effort into it, but if you take the GPS away,
yes.
You're like, oh my God, 1, 2, how many blocks?
Exactly. So that's, there's some authors who are very concerned actually with the whole technological thing that we have going on, like, our phones and GPS and everything. We're not really using our memory as we should, right? But there's so much information that there's no other way around it. I think we have to use those things anyway. But the second
it'd
thing,
be tough. I mean, I don't remember anybody's phone number anymore.
Exactly.
I don't there's
because
a lot of things I don't.
You never put in the effort. I mean, the
Right.
phone does it for you, right? So you will never remember those. You do remember a couple of phones that you really kind of make a point of memorizing because they're important, right? And then you put in the effort and you try to retrieve them a couple of times. We can't say how long or how many times you should retrieve information before it's consolidated, but you have to do it. And the 3 other desirable difficulties are interleaving, which is basically instead of just doing the same thing for a very long time, it's interesting for you to interleave. So you do a block of one skill, one topic, and then you pause, and then you do another block of something else. It's kind of like there's research showing how tennis players can benefit from that, So let's say they're working on their forehand and then they have to work on their backhand, right? So instead of just doing 10 times forehand, 10 times backhand, it's actually better to do forehand, backhand, So that's interleaving. And we can do that with the same type of material. What we normally do when we're studying is that we get like, there's a math exam coming, or a math, history, and geography. So you get like 1 hour to study math, and then you take another hour to study geography. It's actually more interesting if you do like 25 minutes of math, take a break, 25 minutes of history, take a break, 25 minutes of geography, then you go back to math. You can use the Pomodoro technique to help you with that.
I mentioned this in another podcast because I remember you and you were on your social media somewhere holding the little kitchen timer.
Yes. Which, by the way, it's the shape is an actual tomato, that like the Pomodoro timer, because this is interesting. Since our working memory gets overloaded quite fast, which is very limited in terms of capacity, we should take regular breaks. And that's the idea of having a brain break that I like very much. So I try to use the Pomodoro technique even when I'm teaching at Pookie or teaching English, So we're going to have a 25-minute block, and then we take a 1-2 minute break. And then I tell my students, go either water your plants or pat your dogs or whatever you want, listen to some music, and then you come back. And then we kind of retrieve. The moment that they come back, I do a retrieval session. Like, okay, so the first block, what did we talk about? Think about 3 things and share with someone, or let's use a Mentimeter and create a word cloud or something like that. So that's a great one, And the other, so I'm talking too much, I guess. But anyway,
it's
the other
fine,
one.
Don't worry. I'm like, okay, I'm trying to think of lesson plans now. So keep going.
Oh, see, so those are very nice hacks that you can implement. You can embed, into
just
your
right
lessons.
away. It's
Right,
like, okay, how can I split this lesson up? Mm-hmm.
The other one that has a lot to do with retrieving is testing or quizzing, and this is great. Even before you deliver the input, you can quiz students on their prior knowledge, right? And so Piaget was right about, the whole schema thing, that we build new knowledge on top of prior knowledge. So one of the things we should do quite often, if not in every lesson, at the beginning of the very, this lesson, we should quiz our students to see how much they already know about the topic we are about to teach them, because we kind of get everybody on the same page. And then some teachers ask me, but that doesn't that spoil what's coming if we want to elicit and all? Because if we test them, yeah, but it's going to be quite likely more memorable in their brains. Everything is going to stick a little bit longer, let's say, if you quiz them on what you're about to teach them at the beginning of the lesson.
That's interesting, because the TTT method, the framework, the lesson framework, test, teach, test, is not super popular.
Exactly, it isn't, right?
And it seems as if it would be the most beneficial to use brain-wise, right? Would be that one.
Yes, so that's the thing. There's something a little bit interesting. So I think it's quite interesting, actually, about how the brain learns something. And we tend to think of certain hormones in the brain as bad, as negative, like cortisol, for example. And that's the hormone of stress, the stress hormone, right? But a very nice, like a shot of cortisol is actually quite good for your learning, because you're basically in alert. You are alert so that you can take in or pay attention to whatever is being exposed in this environment, this learning teaching environment. When there are no stakes, or when there's no accountability, and that's the funny thing. So if you go to a class where the teacher is never going to ask you anything, you're never going to be called to do anything, and there's no shot of cortisol, you have absolutely no reason to pay attention other than it's rewarding, you really like it, it's interesting, but still your levels of attention are a little bit lower than they could be if there's a little stress, because that the teacher is going to ask you something. If there's too much stress, then you're probably in survival mode, FFF response, and then you don't learn anything.
It kind of reminds me of the idea of if you have that no shot of cortisol, then the teacher is really dependent on your intrinsic motivation, hyper dependent on it.
Exactly.
Because there's no extrinsic motivation whatsoever. It's just
and then
do whatever.
Intrinsic motivation is not so easy to generate.
Exactly.
Students have to be genuinely interested in, because they see some relevance or applicability, and one of the things, and that has a lot to do with dopamine, which is a very important neurotransmitter that basically makes you want to do things, and so that's the thing. A lot of teachers are all fun but no hard work, or no accountability. So we need to use those mechanisms as well, unless, of course, there are other ways we can do that. We can do that outside of the classroom. So nowadays we use different tools like learning management systems like Google Classroom, for example. And then there can be something, the due dates, something that is going to be checked, like a milestone or a progress check or something, just to make your students, to hold them accountable for the things that they do. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And the last one, promise, this is the last one, spacing.
Oh, that's great.
Spacing is a very good strategy. So one of the things that the Bjorks talk about is spaced repetition, right? So normally we don't learn things right away. So basically, anyone listening to us right now, everything we're talking about here, you're going to forget, by the way, most of it.
That's so depressing. Terrible. I've already forgotten. Please, let's go back.
I can remember how I started this thing today. Anyway, because this is really how the brain works, and that means we have to revisit things with a certain frequency, and consolidation of memory actually happens during our sleep. Especially there are different types of memory, of course. So I'm simplifying things, but conceptual memories, so semantic memories or declarative memories, they're part of something that we call declarative memory. So let's say vocabulary, so concepts, right? You need your hippocampus. So hippocampus is a structure that really connects the inner parts of your brain to the cortex, and it's kind of like an elevator. So you have the working memory, and then when your working memory gets full, so the hippocampus kind of, takes whatever is there to a long-term repository, your long-term memory, but it has to go back and forth many times sometimes to really consolidate that. So it could take weeks, it could take months, actually, so we don't know. It depends on the prior knowledge. It depends on the interest, the levels of motivation. There's so many variables, right? But what we do know is you don't just learn things like that, you were exposed to them and then you learn them. I mean, you do pick up a couple of things, and of course they can kind of stick, but normally you have to revisit them with a certain frequency. So the thing you can do that I love doing with my students is I do something called spaced repetition calendar, basically. So if they learn something today, I tell them to revisit that tomorrow, and they can use flashcards because they're testing themselves. So it's the testing effect plus spaced repetition. And then the things that they were able to remember well, they kind of put away for a week. So they don't really have to engage with that for another week. The things that they couldn't remember because they're using flashcards, you can use Quizlet, for example, which is a great tool.
I was just going to say they could use this electronically if they're online.
Exactly.
They could use lots of different things.
Mm-hmm. Lots of different things. So the things that they can remember well, so they put aside for a couple of days a week. The things that they can't remember really well, so they keep there and try again the next day, Okay. So it's spaced repetition. This is excellent for memory consolidation, but very hard for us to keep track of that as well, because the students, they kind of have to do that outside of the classroom. But a final tip, so we can wrap up, is you can actually save 5 minutes of every lesson, your lesson, and then and you can say this is the spaced repetition moment of the lesson. So you guys go back to your flashcards, or if we skipped any activity in the book, or just go back and try to remember those things
at the end of class type of thing, like, okay,
exactly.
Now go back and revisit. Okay,
so we can actually embed that into the lesson as well, and those things are quite interesting. There's a lot of evidence showing that they work. Interleaving, we got to be careful because it doesn't work like that. We just have to know how to interleave well. And those things are basically connected to memory, so we're talking from a cognitive perspective. There's also an emotional perspective, that there are many things we can do emotionally, like help students with their emotional intelligence as well. Otherwise, they're always going to be operating from a sort of a threat type of a mode, which is not really conducive to learning. So
like affective filters, that type of thing that interferes with right.
Krashen was really right about that as well. So there is, he calls it affective filter, but we know that if students are not in the proper emotional state, that they feel that they're going to be exposed or humiliated or laughed at, so they kind of isolate themselves, and then they don't want to talk about things, and they don't learn because they're really afraid. So that's definitely true.
No, good tips. I actually, when you were talking about that, I was thinking, because we do a lot of repetition in a specific lesson to make sure pronunciation wise or meaning or form or however, we do lots of repetition, in the practice and activities, but then we forget to go back and then we test students on it, and then they get frustrated. So,
there's a distance there, right?
Yeah, from my experience working in some language schools and things like that, that it's not actually going to be conducive for them to succeed. So
precisely, right? So just make sure you go back to the contents more frequently, over a longer period of time, not just, especially when you're working at a language academy or a course, or like a regular school. Because the syllabus has to be covered, and there are many things we have to go through in a lesson, right? But just make sure that you go back once or twice before the test, because that's the thing. You teach something and then you wait for the test again. There's a test somewhere, and it might be too far away from when they actually received the input, and then they forgot about it.
Yeah, that can be frustrating. Okay, well, I won't take up too much of your time, but I was so excited to geek out with you. I've learned so many things. I'm really started to think about lesson planning and dealing with students and thinking about their course and their syllabus and how to maybe plan things and take the time to do these activities in the classes. Because I think, like you said, it's proven that it's beneficial. So why not help the brain a little bit?
Definitely. Our brain needs a lot of help, actually. It's not that our brains are not that great, folks. Our memory sucks. We're lazy. Those are our internal biases. That's how the brain evolved.
We do what we can, though. We do what we can.
That's
I do want to say a huge thank you to André. For all of you listening, please follow him at adcrocks.com. He's on social media. I'll link everything in the show notes. There's also his book, The Owl Factor, Reframing Your Teaching Philosophy. And of course, if you can participate in anything with EduFest, there's going to be lots of great people next month. But also you guys have lots of events that you put on as well. So please feel free to follow and reach out. Again, thank you so much for geeking out with me. You're welcome anytime to talk nerd science and education. I love it.
There's a meme. So maybe let me close with the meme. Have you ever seen the cappuccino thing? It's like when somebody asks me about something that I love, and then it's kind of spilling over all over the place because, I can't stop talking. So it's a cappuccino meme. It just came to my mind right now. So that's
if we can find it, I'll post it so we can put it here.
Yeah. When
so
somebody talks to me about something that I love and then just, a cappuccino spilling over everywhere because I can't stop talking. So that's the meme.
That's passion, though. That's a great thing to have.
It is passion, I think. Yeah, great. And thank you so much for having me here, Kelly.
Absolutely.
It was really a pleasure. Thank you.
Great.
Ready to join the conversation? Head on over to Instagram at Real Talk and ELT Pod or at Kelly Pennington ELT and send me a message. That's it for me. Take care of yourself, your health, your vibe, and your tribe. Until next time.